I stood in the county assessor's office on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, holding a cashier's check for $12.17. While Frank Dullen, 60 years old, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked at me the way men look at other men when they think they're watching someone make the worst mistake of their life. He picked up the check with two fingers like it might be contagious. 22 acres, he said. Seasonal wetland, no road access. Floods every spring. I know. Tax delinquent since 2009. He set the check down and leaned back in his chair. County's been trying to unload it for 15 years. I know that too. He studied me for a moment. The kind of study that takes in the work boots, the calloused hands, the gray at the temples, the particular stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. How old are you? 58. He picked up his pencil and tapped the plat map twice. And you want to buy a swamp? I looked at him steadily. I want to buy my father's land. Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly. More like recognition, the look of a man who has seen enough of life to know that some decisions don't require explanation. He took the check, stamped the deed transfer without counting the money, and slid the paper across the desk. Parcel 4-7-22, Clatsop County, Oregon, 22.4 acres. Seasonal wetland, no structures, no utilities access via adjoining property only. I folded the deed and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket right against my chest and walked out into the rain. My father, Dale Wills, died in January 2024. Lung cancer. He was quiet about it the way he was quiet about everything. Said nothing until there was nothing left to say, and then said goodbye in 4 words on a piece of paper that his hospice nurse handed me when I arrived 2 hours too late. The 4 words were, "Come home, Garrett. Please." I had not spoken to my father in 23 years. Not since the summer of 2001, when I was 31 years old and angry in the particular way that sons get angry at fathers when they're convinced the old man never understood them and never tried. I left the farm outside Vernonia on a Thursday afternoon in August with 2 duffel bags and a truck that burned oil. I drove north to Portland and did not look back. Got my contractor's license. Built a career with my hands the way my father had built his, just in a different place with different materials, telling myself it was a different life. For 23 years, I told myself that. When I got the call about the cancer, I drove back in February. Too late for conversations. Just in time for the paperwork. What my father left me was a 1947 craftsman house on 8 acres outside Vernonia, a barn I could stand upright in, a well that still ran clean, and $89,000 in debt on a mortgage from Cascade Regional Bank that was 6 payments behind. He also left me a voicemail I hadn't known about until the hospice nurse showed me his phone. Recorded 3 weeks before he died at 2 in the morning. His voice was thin but steady. He said my name once. Then he said, "The barn, under the tarp, under the tractor. Read it first. Read all of it. Don't let the bank have it." I did not know what he was talking about. I found out 3 days later. The barn smelled the way barns smell when they have been tending themselves for years. Old hay machine oil rust, and something underneath all of that, something dry and deep, like the earth remembering what it used to hold. I walked the length of it with a flashlight because the wiring had not been reliable since the 90s. At the far end, under a canvas tarp stiff with age, sat a 1954 Farmall Cub. It had not run in longer than I could remember. The wheel wells were packed with dried mud that had turned to dust. I stood there for a moment looking at it, remembering the summer my father taught me to drive it, how he had stood beside me in the field with his hand on my shoulder and said nothing. Just let me feel the weight of the machine under my hands and figure the rest out for myself. I pulled the tarp off and checked underneath. Pushed back into the shadows behind the front axle was a wooden crate lid nailed down. I pried it open with a flathead I found on the workbench. Inside was a notebook. Bound in cracked brown leather, the pages yellowed and soft at the edges, carrying the particular smell of old paper that has nothing to do with decay and everything to do with time. My father's handwriting in faded blue ink, tight and slanted, the same handwriting on every birthday card that had stopped arriving after 2001. I took it to the workbench and read the first entry by flashlight. April 9th, 1968. Bought the Nilam tract today. 22 acres. Paid the back taxes. $11. Nobody wanted it. Let them laugh. I set the flashlight down. April 9th, 1968. I was born in March 1970. My father had bought that land nearly 2 years before I existed, before he could have known I would exist. I turned the page. There were drawings, not rough sketches, careful, deliberate topographic work, the kind that takes patience and a steady hand, and something that functions like love for the subject. Elevation lines, water flow patterns, sediment layers marked with different pencil pressures, notations in the margins in my father's tight script. Creek diversion points, gravel bar formations, depth estimates for different sections of the property. And on the third page, underlined, once gold moves downstream. Always has, always will. You just have to know where it stops. I stood in that barn for a long time. Outside, the rain had picked up. I could hear it on the metal roof, steady and indifferent, the way Oregon rain sounds in March, when it has nowhere to be and all day to get there. I read every page of that notebook, standing at that workbench with the flashlight in my hand and the cold working its way through my jacket. 43 entries, spanning from 1968 to 1981. Topographic observations, water table readings, soil composition notes from different sections of the wetland property, and woven through all of it, the same quiet certainty there was gold in that land. Not a rumor, not a hope. A documented fact recorded with the same meticulous care my father had given to everything he'd ever done. The last entry was dated September 14th, 1981. One sentence buried the last of the first run today. Back channel near the split oak. If someone finds this place after I'm gone, I hope they're smart enough to keep their mouth shut. I closed the notebook and put it in my jacket. Then I went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table until the rain stopped, thinking about a man I had spent 23 years trying to stop thinking about. The next morning, I drove to the county assessor's office to ask for the original survey maps of the Nehalem tract, the ones from when the county first platted the land in 1891. Donna, the clerk, maybe 50 reading glasses on a beaded chain, disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a rolled tube of linen paper that smelled like a century of attic dust. She spread it across the counter under the fluorescent light. I found the tract immediately, labeled in faded ink swampland, unsuitable for agriculture. But in the lower right corner, written in pencil by a surveyor named H. Caldwell, was a notation that no one had bothered to act on in the 130 years since he'd written it. Creek diverted 1889 following flood event. Original channel runs northeast through parcel 7. I traced the line with my finger. The original creek bed ran straight through the center of that land, then curved east toward what was now the neighboring property line. Exactly where my father had mapped his gravel bars. Exactly where he had marked his deepest finds. Donna charged me $4 for a copy. That afternoon, I walked the Nehalem tract for the first time since I was a teenager. Wore my father's old waders, the ones with the patch on the left thigh fixed with electrical tape sometime in the 90s. The ground was soft and waterlogged, covered in cattails and skunk cabbage, the air sharp with standing water and wet soil. I followed the depression in the earth where the old channel would have run, stepping over rotted logs, testing each step with a walking stick before committing my weight. About 250 yards in, I found what I was looking for. A low ridge of gravel and clay, maybe 15 feet wide, running perpendicular to the current drainage direction. Exactly where my father had marked bar number 1 in his sketch drawn in 1968, 56 years before I stood over it. I knelt and dug with my hands. 6 inches down, the soil changed. Coarser, darker, mixed with smooth river stones the size of my thumb. The kind of material that deposits in one specific situation when fast-moving water loses its energy suddenly and drops everything it has been carrying. I filled a mason jar and carried it back to solid ground. I bought a gold pan that afternoon from the hardware store on Main Street. $12. The clerk, a man about my age named Walt, looked at the pan, looked at me, looked at the pan again. "Panning up at the state park," he said. "No, trying something on my property." He nodded the way men nod when they don't believe you, but respect your right to your own business. I also picked up a jeweler's loop and a set of plastic vials with screw tops. $35 total. Back at the farm, I sat on the porch steps with a 5-gallon bucket of water and worked through the material. The first 3 attempts, I lost everything. Wrong angle, wrong rhythm. On the 4th try, I found them. 3 specks, smaller than grains of sand, sitting in the bottom curve of the pan, bright yellow, heavier than everything else in the world. I used the tip of a toothpick to move them into a vial. Then I did it again. and again. By the time the sun dropped behind the barn, I had 7 vials lined up on the porch railing, each one holding a few specks at the bottom. A tenth of a gram total. $5 worth of gold at current prices if I was being precise about it. $5 from half a jar of mud and 3 hours of work. I sat there turning those vials in my fingers while the sky went dark and the stars came out over the tree line. I did not go inside for a long time. Not because of the $5. Because my father had known this was here, had mapped it, documented it, worked it for years, and I had been 3 hours north in Portland for 2 decades, not asking, not calling, not listening. What I held in my hand was not just gold, it was proof that my father had been right about something, and I had not been around to see it. I drove into Portland the following Thursday and met with Douglas Merritt. Merritt was the senior loan officer at Cascade Regional Bank's estate division. Mid-40s, good suit, the careful haircut of a man who bills by the hour. He had a file on his desk with my father's name on the tab and a legal pad with numbers already written on it when I sat down. He told me the bank's position: 6 missed payments, compounding penalty interest. The property was scheduled for foreclosure review in 90 days unless the arrears were settled in full. He also mentioned in the measured tone of a man who has delivered this particular message many times that a land management company from Eugene had expressed serious interest in the property. They were prepared to offer fair market value, settle the outstanding debt, and close within 30 days. "What's fair market value?" I said. He told me. It was enough to pay off the mortgage and leave me with approximately $40,000. I looked at the file on his desk. I thought about the notebook in my jacket. I thought about those 7 vials on the porch railing. "I'll need the 90 days, I said. Merritt wrote something on his legal pad. "Of course, but I'd encourage you to consider the offer seriously, Mr. Wills. Rural properties in that area move slowly when they move at all. The buyer we have is motivated." I thanked him and drove back to Vernonia in the rain. That night I spread the county survey maps across the kitchen table next to my father's notebook and sat there until midnight cross-referencing every entry with every topographic feature I could match. The old creek had run through that land in 3 main branches before the county drainage project of 1974 redirected everything into the ditch along County Road 14. One branch cut through the south field. One ran along the northern property line. The third, the one my father had documented most extensively, the one he'd returned to again and again, across 43 entries, curved through the back section of the Nehalem tract, the part that stayed wet 10 months out of 12. He had called it the Deep Channel in his notes. First documented it in 1949 before he owned the land, before he had done anything except walk it and pay attention. That was the thing about my father that I had never given him credit for when I was young. He paid attention to everything. Quietly, without announcing it, without asking for recognition. He watched and he listened and he recorded what he found, and he waited for the moment when the information would matter. I went to the county assessor's office the next morning and handed Frank Dullen a check for $12.17. The deed sat against my chest through the drive back, through the afternoon of clearing brush from the path to the Nehalem tract, through the evening of sharpening shovels in the barn by lamplight. I was 58 years old. I had a mortgage I could not pay and a land management company from Eugene circling my father's property. I had 90 days in a dead man's notebook. What I had underneath all of that was something simpler. My father had put something in this land for someone to find. He had put it there before I was born, and he had spent 30 years adding to it, and he had never told a living soul. The only question that mattered was whether I was going to be the one who found it, or whether I was going to let Douglas Merritt's bank find it instead. I drove into Clatskanie on a Friday morning and found the prospecting supply shop on Nehalem Street, a converted garage with a hand-painted sign and a bell above the door. Vince Colton was behind the counter. 63 years old, hands like tree roots, a baseball cap from the Siskiyou County Gold Miners Association, worn soft from years of use. He looked up when I came in with the unhurried attention of a man who has made his peace with the pace of things. I told him I was working a claim near missed. He did not ask for details. He showed me the sluice boxes along the far wall and explained the trade-offs with the patience of a man who has explained them many times and found a way to make them interesting each time. He showed me how to set the angle, how to classify material before running it, how to clean the riffles without losing the fine gold you had spent all day collecting. I bought the sluice, a set of classifying screens, a snuffer bottle, and a blue cleanup tray. $61. I drove back to the farm with the sluice in the truck bed and my father's notebook open on the passenger seat. I set the sluice up in the creek along the eastern edge of the Nehalem tract, where the current was fast enough to keep material moving, but not so aggressive it would strip everything clean. The ground was soft and cold, and my boots sank 2 inches with each step. I transferred my father's grid system onto a legal pad, adapting his landmarks to what I could find on the ground. The split oak, the buried fence post, the place where 2 drainage ditches met at an angle that matched no county map. I started at the southern edge and worked north. Some buckets came up clean. Some gave me 2 or 3 specks. One bucket from a low depression 30 yards south of the property line gave me enough color to fill half a vial on its own dense flakes, sitting in the pan bottom like they had been waiting for exactly this moment. I wrote everything down: grid coordinates, depth, soil color and texture, whether the material was loose or compacted, whether there was clay present or pure sand. Without meaning to, I was using my father's shorthand. The same notations, the same way of marking a promising location with a small circle and an unproductive one with a straight line. By the end of the first week, I had identified 3 distinct bands of concentrated material running east to west across the property. They followed the old water channels my father had drawn in his notebook, the buried creek beds that the 1974 drainage project had erased from the surface, but not from the ground beneath it. Water has a memory. That was what my father had written on page 11, and it had not meant anything to me when I first read it. It meant everything now. By the 10th day, I had collected approximately 40 grams, somewhere between $2,200 and $2,500 depending on purity. I kept it in a mason jar under the kitchen sink wrapped in a dish towel. I did not tell anyone. On the 14th day, I was working 60 yards downstream from the first color site when the tip of my shovel hit something that was not mud, not gravel, not root, solid metal. I set the shovel aside and cleared the area with my hands working carefully. 6 inches down, then 8, then 10. A coffee can, the old large format kind, the label dissolved into the soil decades ago. The rim had been sealed with roofing tar packed carefully around the edge. The lid itself was gone, rusted to nothing, but the seal had held. I carried it back to the farmhouse without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, sat down across from it. There was writing on the side in faded black marker. My father's handwriting. 1967, 1969. I opened it with a church key from the junk drawer, working around the tar seal slowly. The smell that came out when the seal broke was cold and mineral and old, the smell of something held in darkness for a very long time. Inside were 12 small leather pouches, each tied with waxed linen string. I opened the first one. Gold. Nuggets mostly. Some the size of a pea. A few larger, irregular, the kind that form in narrow quartz seams over thousands of years. I set them on the kitchen scale, the kind used for cooking, accurate to a gram. The first pouch, 41 grams. The second, 38. The third, 52. I stopped counting after the 5th pouch. My hands were shaking. There had to be 450, maybe 500 grams in that single can. 16 ounces. At current prices, $32,000. Sitting in the mud under my father's land for 57 years. I sat there until the light through the kitchen window turned orange, then gray. Then I opened the notebook to the entry dated April 3rd, 1969, pulled 14 ounces from the back channel this month. George said I should tell the county. I told him the county doesn't need to know everything. 14 ounces. At today's prices, $28,000. From 1 month in 1969. I did the math slowly, the way you do when the numbers are large enough that you need to be certain you have not made an error. If my father had worked this land consistently from 1968 through the early 1980s, even part-time, even only in the seasons when the water levels were right, the total would have been substantial. Not theoretical. Documented in 43 entries of careful handwriting in a leather notebook that had been sitting under a tractor for 40 years. Nobody had known. Not the neighbors, not the county, not the bank, not me. Nobody except my father, who had kept it the way he kept everything, quietly, carefully, entirely on his own terms. Then I found the note. At the bottom of the can, beneath the last leather pouch, folded twice and wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry and legible across 5.5 decades. My father's handwriting, undated. If you found this, you found the first one. There are 6 more. I know you. You'll want to quit when it gets hard. Don't. The land doesn't give up what it's holding until you've earned the right to ask for it. D.W. I read it 4 times. I know you. He had written that from across 57 years and 23 years of silence. He had written it before I existed in any form that could be known, when I was still a future possibility that hadn't yet decided to become real. And he had understood me well enough to predict exactly what I would do in the hardest moment. I set the note on the table next to the open can. Then I went to the sink and ran cold water over my hands for a long time. Not because they were dirty, but because I needed something immediate and physical to focus on while the room settled back into its correct dimensions. Douglas Merritt called the following Tuesday. His tone had shifted since our meeting in Portland. Still measured, still professional, but with something underneath it now. A subtle increase in pressure, the kind you learn to recognize after 30 years in construction. Reading job sites telling the difference between a client who is patient and one who is running out of it. The land management company from Eugene had increased their offer. The foreclosure review timeline had been moved up by 2 weeks due to an administrative adjustment in the bank's processing schedule. He wanted to make sure I understood my options clearly. I listened to all of it and told him I was still working within our established timeline and would be in touch before the deadline. After I hung up, I pulled out the mortgage documents from my father's filing cabinet and read through the full agreement for the first time. On page 11, buried in a subsection about collateral and asset encumbrance, was a clause I had missed on the first reading. In the event of foreclosure and property transfer to the lending institution, all mineral rights associated with the property would transfer as well, including any extraction rights previously held by the borrower or the borrower's estate. My father had signed this in 1987. I was 17 years old in 1987, still living on the farm 2 years before the first serious argument and 14 years before the one that ended things. He may not have understood the full weight of that clause when he signed it. Legal documents are written specifically to discourage careful reading. Or he had understood it and signed it anyway, trusting with the same steady certainty he brought to everything that the land would stay in the family, that someone would come back for it. Either way, the meaning was the same now. If Merritt's bank completed the foreclosure, every gram of gold in that wetland, every leather pouch, every buried can, everything my father had spent 30 years building would belong to Cascade Regional Bank. I went back out to the Nehalem tract with a longer shovel and kept working. The second can was near the old culvert on the access road. My father's entry from June 1970 said he'd buried something 6 feet upstream north bank 2 feet down. The metal detector I'd ordered online signaled before I'd cleared the first layer of weeds. 20 minutes of careful digging and the can came free, with a sound the mud made reluctantly, the way mud sounds, when it has been holding something long enough to consider it its own. Inside, 40 rolls of quarters, $400 exactly, and a folded piece of notebook paper wrapped in oilcloth. You found 2, 5 more. Keep going. 3 words less than the last note, as if he trusted me a little more with each one I found. The third and fourth cans came within 3 days of each other. The split oak on the east fence line gave up a can with more nuggets, a cloth bag of 1921 Morgan silver dollars heavy and cold in the palm, and no note at all. I took the absence of a note as its own kind of message. The chicken coop floor was more deliberate. Someone had cut a section from the floorboards and laid it back flush, invisible until you pulled the nesting box away from the corner wall. The can inside held rolled bills from the 1950s, a receipt from a Dalton feed store dated August 1978, and on the back of the receipt, in my father's handwriting, paid in full. Kept the change. I did not know what that meant. I kept the receipt. The moment I nearly quit came on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of March. I had been in the back section of the Nehalem tract since 5 in the morning. The ground there was a different category of difficult black mud, nearly liquid in places, the kind that takes your boot and keeps it, the kind that makes each step a negotiation between your body and the earth. I had found 4 cans in 2 weeks. I was still $61,000 short of what I needed to settle the mortgage before Merritt moved. My knees ached from the cold in a way they had not at 40. My hands had developed a tremble at the end of long days that I told myself was fatigue. I sat down on a fallen log at 2 in the afternoon and looked out at the flat gray water and the cattails and thought about the land management company in Eugene. I thought about $40,000 and a clean exit. About Portland, about the small apartment I'd maintained for years, about the life I had built in the deliberate absence of this place. I took out my phone and found Merritt's number. Then I reached into my jacket for the notebook, intending to put it away before I made the call. My thumb found the April 1969 entry without meaning to. Pulled 14 ounces from the back channel this month. George said I should tell the county. I told him the county doesn't need to know everything. My father had sat on this ground. He had stood in this mud. He had been in this exact place alone without anyone knowing, without any guarantee it would ever matter. And he had kept going. I put the phone away, stood up, and walked into the deep channel section. The ground here was exactly what the notebook described: compact gravel at 22 inches depth, running in a band roughly 12 feet wide. I could feel the change in resistance when the shovel hit it. A different sound, a different weight. The first bucket came up heavy with color. Not specks. Actual flake bright, distinct. I ran it twice to be certain. Same result. 8 vials by the time the light dropped. 6 grams, maybe more. The best single day since I'd started. My father had written, "The land doesn't give up what it's holding until you've earned the right to ask for it." I was beginning to understand what earning it meant. The root cellar sat at the northwest corner of the barn foundation, half buried in the earth, like something that had decided to return to where it came from. The door was old-growth fir, 2 inches thick, set at 45 degrees into the ground, the way they built them when the goal was stable temperature, and the builder trusted the earth. The padlock was a heavy-gauge master lock from the 1970s, back when American hardware was built to outlast the people who bought it. 40 years of Oregon winters had done their work. The keyhole had oxidized completely shut. The shackle had surface rust deep enough to change the shape of the metal. I spent 3 days on it. WD-40 a full can working into every seam. Overnight, no change. White vinegar packed into the keyhole with cotton, 12 hours. Then professional penetrating oil from the hardware store. Nothing. The door itself had sunk into the ground. The bottom hinge corroded, the wood swollen, until the lower edge was buried 4 inches in compacted soil. Through a 3-inch gap at the top, darkness, cold stone, and underneath both something metallic and faint. The smell of old coins and sealed glass. The particular scent of metal sitting undisturbed in darkness for a very long time. Something was in there. I could not get to it. I drove into Millerton on a Thursday morning for fence staples and treated posts. Briggs Farm Supply on the main road, a family operation since the Eisenhower years, according to the hand-painted timeline on the back wall. Earl Briggs was behind the counter. 62 years old, pioneer seed cap flannel shirt. The unhurried manner of a man who has run the same counter for 30 years and stopped needing it to be anything other than what it was. He looked up when I came in. He held the look a half-second longer than a stranger would. "You're Dale's boy," he said. Not a question. "Garrett," I said. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he has been waiting a long time to confirm. He came around the counter and extended his hand. The grip was firm and brief. "Your father came in here every other Saturday for 30 years, he said. Same things every time. Fencing supplies mostly. Sometimes seed. Always cash. Never once tried to negotiate the price." He paused. Good man. Quiet in a way that meant something. He studied my face for a moment, reading something I hadn't consciously offered. "You working the property?" "Trying to." He went back behind the counter and wrote up the order without me reciting the specifications. He already knew the gauge, already knew the quantities, as if he had been carrying this order in his head for a while and had simply been waiting for me to show up and claim it. While the receipt printed, he reached under the counter. His hand came back up holding a key, brass old-style cut with a file rather than a machine. On a loop of baling wire twisted and retwisted until it held its shape on its own. He set it on the counter between us. "He left this in September of 1989, Earl said. "Came in on a Saturday, same as always. Bought his fencing supplies. Before he left, he set this on the counter and said," he paused, retrieving the exact words, not a paraphrase, the actual words he'd been holding for 35 years. He said, "If anything ever happens to me and a Wills comes in asking about a lock, give them this." I looked at the key. "I figured he was being dramatic," Earl said. "Men get that way sometimes. Making arrangements. Thinking about the long view. I put it in the drawer that night, figuring I'd give it back to him the following Saturday, and we'd both have a laugh about it." He looked at me steadily. "He never asked for it back." I picked up the key. It was lighter than I expected, warm from the drawer. The teeth were clean, no oxidation, no wear at all. Whatever lock this key was made for, it had been waiting 35 years and was still ready to do its job. My father had left this key here in 1989. I was 19 years old in 1989, still on the farm, Still 2 years from the first real argument, 12 years from the one that ended everything between us. He had not done this in crisis. He had not done it at the end running out of time trying to correct mistakes. He had done it on an ordinary Saturday in September 1989 when there was no urgency, no reason except that he was a man who thought far ahead and trusted that what he prepared would be needed eventually. He had known before the silence, before the years before any of it, that I would stand in this store someday asking about a lock. I put the key in my shirt pocket. Earl stapled my receipt to the order slip. Post will be out front. I went to load the truck without saying anything else. There was nothing that needed saying. I drove back to the farm without stopping. Did not unload the fence posts. Did not go inside the house. Walked directly to the northwest corner of the barn foundation with the key in my right hand. Knelt down in front of the root cellar door. The padlock hung from the hasp at eye level reddish-brown with oxidation shaped by decades of weather into something that looked like it had grown there rather than been installed. I looked at the key, 5 teeth varying depths, a profile that fits exactly one thing in the world. My father had made this key, had carried it to Earl's counter on a Saturday morning in 1989, and left it without ceremony or explanation, trusting that a man he saw every 2 weeks for 30 years would hold it until the right person came asking. That was the kind of man my father was. Not demonstrative, not loud about his love or his plans or his reasons. Just steady, just certain, just prepared for a future that most people would have called unknowable. I put the key in the lock. It went in cleanly. No hesitation, no adjustment needed. The fit of something made for exactly this purpose and no other. One turn, one clean click. The shackle released. I lifted the door with both hands. Heavier than it looked, decades of moisture in the grain, the swollen wood adding weight the frame did not show. I propped it open with a cinder block from the barn foundation and stood at the opening for a moment. Stone steps led down into darkness. I used my phone's flashlight. The air that rose from below was cold and genuinely dry. Not damp, not musty, which should not have been possible for a structure set into Oregon ground. But the limestone walls and the careful original construction had maintained something stable down there across 4 decades. 50 degrees maybe. Consistent. The temperature of a place that has been kept. My father had understood this when he built it. He had chosen limestone for a reason. He had set the angle and the depth for a reason. He had built something that would last longer than he needed it to because he was building it for someone who wasn't ready yet. I went down, 7 steps each one, cut from the same limestone as the walls level, and precise the work of a man who did things right the first time because he knew he would only do them once. The ceiling was low enough that I had to angle my head. The room itself was 12 feet by 8. Dirt floor packed hard as concrete. Wooden shelves along the back wall built from old-growth lumber that had not warped or softened in 40 years. And on those shelves, arranged in rows with the careful order of a man who respected what he was keeping. 17 mason jars. I picked up the closest one and held it to the phone light. Silver dollars. Morgan dollars and peace dollars packed tight, stacked on their edges to fit as many as possible into the given space. The jar next to it, more coins. The one after rolled bills, 50s and 100s in bundles, the rubber bands long since rotted to black dust, the bills held together now by nothing but their own compression and time. I did not open all of them. I sat down on the bottom step with my back against the cold stone wall and looked at those 17 jars in the beam of my phone's light and tried to calculate what I was looking at and could not, because the math was complicated, but because my mind kept moving away from the numbers towards something else entirely. My father had filled these jars one coin at a time, one bill at a time, over years, over decades, in silence so complete that no one, not a neighbor, not a friend, not his own son, had known it was happening. He had built something down here, not just saved money, built something the way you build a barn or a fence line piece by piece, with intention, with a specific destination held steady in front of you, even when no one else can see it. I sat there until my legs went numb against the cold stone and my phone battery dropped to 9%. Then I climbed out, set the cinder block aside, and let the door fall shut. It settled with a sound that was soft and final, like the closing of something that had been waiting a very long time to be opened and was now at last at rest. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's ledger, the formal accounting book, not the notebook, the one where he had kept the farm records across 4 decades. It was meticulous. Crop yields, equipment repairs itemized by part and hour, payments to the feed co-op, the county extension office, the veterinarian in Vernonia. The kind of careful, ordinary accounting a man keeps when he takes his responsibilities seriously and does not trust anyone else to track them for him. I read through the 1970s, through the 1980s, through the years when I had been a child on this farm watching my father do this work without understanding what I was watching. Normal, precise, unremarkable. Until page 47, March 14th, 1970. No crop entry, no equipment note, no payment record, no dollar amount. 4 words in my father's handwriting. The ink pressed slightly deeper into the page than usual, as if the pen had been held a little tighter than normal, as if the hand behind it understood the weight of what it was recording. For when he's ready. I was born on March 14th, 1970. My father had written those words on the day I came into the world. Not about money, not about gold or silver or hidden cans in the mud. About me. About a future he was already building on the day I took my first breath, with no way of knowing whether I would ever come back to claim it, trusting with the full weight of his particular and unshakable faith that I would. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The ledger was open in front of me. The lamp on the counter threw a circle of yellow light across the floor. Outside, the Oregon night was quiet in the way it gets in April, when the rain has stopped and the frogs have not yet started, and there is a window of complete stillness between one season and the next. I thought about 23 years. I thought about a Thursday afternoon in August, 2001, 2 duffel bags, a truck that burned oil, a road north that I told myself I would not come back from. I thought about the pride that had made the silence feel like a choice rather than a loss. I thought about all the Saturdays my father had driven into Millerton and bought his fencing supplies and driven back alone, and all the Saturdays he had gone out to that wetland in his waders and worked the ground by himself, and all the evenings he had sat at this same table with this same ledger and made his careful entries without anyone to share them with. He had not been waiting for an apology. He had not been waiting for me to come back humble or changed or full of explanations. He had just been waiting for me to be ready. And he had built something in the meantime so that when I finally was, I would have what I needed to stay. I called Douglas Merritt the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting for the call. I told him I was prepared to settle the mortgage in full, including all penalties and accrued interest within the next 30 days. I told him the land management company's offer would not be necessary. I told him in the level tone of a man who has made his decision and does not need to be talked out of it, that the property was not for sale and was not going to be. There was a pause on his end. "Mr. Wills," he said carefully, "the total amount owed, including penalties, is now—" "I know what it is," I said. "I'll be in touch within 30 days. He reminded me of the mineral rights clause. His tone had changed now, not aggressive but precise, the precision of a man who wants you to understand the full dimensions of the wall in front of you. I told him I had read the clause. I told him I intended to settle the entire debt before any foreclosure proceedings were initiated. Another pause. "Then I'll note that in the file." I thanked him and hung up. Getting the gold and coins properly appraised took 3 weeks and required a level of patience I had not needed since the longest construction projects of my career. I drove to Portland and found an estate appraiser who handled precious metals, a methodical woman in her 50s named Carol Strand, who worked out of a small office near the Pearl District and did not ask unnecessary questions. She weighed, tested, and documented everything over 2 separate appointments. The gold came in at just over 640 grams. When everything was consolidated, the nuggets from the cans, the flake from the deep channel work, the material I had processed through the sluice over 6 weeks of systematic effort. At current spot prices accounting for purity, it came to just over $38,000. The coins were a different matter. The Morgan and Peace dollars Carol examined were in better condition than they had any right to be, after decades in sealed jars in an underground limestone room. Several of the Morgans were in grades that put them well above melt value. The rolled bills from the 1950s included several notes that a currency dealer she contacted valued significantly above face. When Carol handed me the final summary at the second appointment, I sat in her office for a moment looking at the number at the bottom of the page. It was enough to pay the mortgage in full, including every penalty and every dollar of accrued interest. It was enough to repair the barn roof, replace the irrigation lines that had been failing since 2018, and rebuild the south pasture fence line properly. It was enough to purchase 6 bred heifers from a dairy operation 2 counties over that I had already called about. It was enough to keep the farm running for 2 years if I was careful, and I had been careful my entire life, and I intended to keep being careful for however many years I had left. I folded the summary and put it in my jacket pocket. These were well kept, Carol said, nodding toward the coins. My father kept them, I said. She looked at me for a moment. He understood what he had. Yes, I said, he did. I settled the mortgage on a Thursday morning in May, drove to the Cascade Regional Bank branch in Vernonia, sat across from a different loan officer younger than Merritt, less certain of herself, and placed a certified check on the desk between us. She processed it without comment. When she handed me the lien release documentation, I folded it once and put it in the same jacket pocket where I had carried the deed to the Neelam tracts since March. The 2 pieces of paper together. The land my father had bought in 1968 and the debt cleared from the land his father had farmed before him. Douglas Merritt called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The barn got a new roof in June, the first one in 22 years. I hired 2 men from town to help with the framing and did the finish work myself the way I had done finish work on other people's buildings for 3 decades. It took 11 days. When it was done, I stood in the yard and looked at it in the evening light, the clean lines of new metal against the old wood, and thought about all the rain that had come through the old roof and all the rain that would now be turned away. The heifers arrived in July, 6 of them calm and heavy, moving into the south pasture with the quiet confidence of animals that have been well treated and expect to continue being well treated. I spent the first week just watching them move across the field in the long afternoon light, remembering what the farm had sounded like when I was a boy, and there had been cattle in that pasture, and my father had leaned on the fence rail in the evenings watching them the same way I was watching them now. I named one of them Dale. She was the largest of the 6, a deep reddish brown, with the unhurried manner of an animal that understood its own weight in the world. She came to the fence on the 3rd day and let me put my hand on her neck without moving away. I stood there with my hand on her and looked out across the pasture, toward the Nilam tract, toward the cattails and the black water, and the 22 acres of wetland that nobody had wanted for 15 years. And I thought about everything that had been held in that ground. The cover crop went in the back field in August. I cleared the fence line along the north pasture boundary and rebuilt the gate my father had originally hung in 1981, using the same post holes, the same hardware, where it was still serviceable, replacing only what the years had taken. The hinges I used came from Briggs Farm Supply. Earl rang me up without comment the first time I came in after the mortgage was settled, same as always. But when I was heading out the door, he said without looking up from the counter, "Your father would have liked knowing you stayed." I stopped in the doorway. "He knew I would," I said. Earl looked up then. He nodded once slowly with the particular gravity of a man who has been carrying something for 35 years and is relieved at last to set it down. People in town stopped asking when I was leaving sometime in September. Started asking instead how the heifers were doing, whether the cover crop had taken, whether I was planning to expand the pasture acreage in the spring. Normal questions. The questions you ask a man who belongs to a place. I answered them the way my father would have answered them, briefly, accurately, without elaboration. I was learning at 58 what he had known at 30, that the land asks more than it announces, and the men who last are the ones who stop needing it to be otherwise. I still go down to the root cellar sometimes. The jars are gone now. The coins and the bills have been converted, documented, accounted for, put to the uses my father spent 30 years preparing them for. But I left the shelves exactly as they were. The old-growth lumber my father set in place, the careful spacing between the rows, the level precision of a man who built things right the first time. I sit on the bottom step and I do not do anything in particular. I think about my father filling those jars in the years before I was born, and in the years when I was a boy watching him, without understanding what I was watching, and in the years after I left when he was alone with the land and the silence and the long patience of a man who knows that time works in one direction, and he is going to make use of every bit of it. I think about a Saturday morning in September 1989, a key set on a counter, 3 sentences spoken to a man who stored it in a drawer for 35 years without knowing why. I think about 4 words written on March 14, 1970, pressed into a page with slightly more force than usual by a man who had just become a father and already knew what he was going to build. For when he's ready. There is a particular weight that comes with being the one nobody thought could handle it. The debt, the land, the silence, the thing that someone left behind and trusted you to carry. You know the weight, I mean, if you have ever stood in the middle of something that felt too large for you and found out slowly that you were wrong about your own size. My father knew I would come back. He knew it before I was born. He spent his whole life making sure that when I did, there would be something here worth coming back to. I did not get to tell him that I understood. I did not get to sit across from him at this kitchen table and say that I finally saw what he had been doing, that I finally had the years and the humility to recognize the shape of what he built. That conversation is gone. 23 years and 2 hours took it from both of us, and there is no version of the story where that is not a loss. But I am here. The land is here. The gate he hung in 1981 is still hanging with new hinges in the same post holes. And in a pasture outside Vernonia, Oregon, a reddish-brown heifer named Dale is moving through the long grass in the evening light, unhurried, certain of her place, the way things move when they know they are exactly where they are supposed to be.